Hey guys, want to build a robot? You know, I love a good robot chassis. We spent months trying to find the perfect chassis for our ESP32 Voyager and Explorer robot. And once we did, we were so excited. Having an awesome, solid robot chassis means that you can build so many amazing projects around it. And whenever we found the chassis that we used for our ESP32 and Voyager, we were so excited. It was tracked, it was all metal, it had powerful motors, and it was also super versatile. So if you picked up either that tank chassis kit from us on our website or the ESP32 Explorer and Voyager, and you're looking for a more in-depth guide about how to put that chassis together, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Our first step is going to be putting together the active gear that's connected to our DC motor. Now, there are a few different M3s in this kit, but it's really important to use the flathead M3s because otherwise the head of the other M3s would get in the way of the wheel moving. You'll also notice that this piece looks almost symmetrical, but one side is slightly larger than the other. The other side of this metal piece fits perfectly with those DC motors. The process of attaching is super straightforward. All you have to do is screw in those M3s. You are going to want to make sure that you get these good and tight. If you have an extra flathead screwdriver lying around as well to get a better grip on that bolt, you may want to make sure and just give it a little bit of an extra twist. So now we're going to go ahead and actually build that gear. Luckily in your kits, all the pieces you need for one gear are put together in a bag, and that makes it really easy to keep organized. Here I'm just kind of grabbing all the pieces I need to show you guys everything that needs to go in. These right here are the set screws. This is probably the most important part of the project, and unfortunately also the smallest, so be sure to keep an eye on those set screws. We've got some other M3s, some standoffs. Now this is the M4. You'll notice that the M4 is way larger than the M3, and the M4 is used to attach the gear to the motor coupler. But the M3s are used to keep the whole thing together. So that right there is the motor coupler there. And now, the weirdest part of this build is probably the very beginning. So you're going to want to make sure you have one washer that goes through. But also, you're going to want to include 6 M4 washers. You put on 6 of those M4 washers before you put that motor coupler on there. I grabbed 8 here in this picture, but you really only need 6. 6 is the perfect amount for the spacing that we need. Once you have those 6 M4 washers, all you need to do is screw on that motor coupler. Don't worry about getting that on there too tight because we're going to tighten the whole thing once we have it all constructed. Next, we're going to take our M3s, and it's really important that you have a washer for each bolt. That makes sure these things stay good and tight. So you'll notice there are 3 holes on that driving gear, and so you're going to put an M3 with a washer through all 3 holes, and also put a standoff on the end of each one. Once you have all three standoffs screwed in with those M3s, you're gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay. Now, once you have the whole thing constructed, you're gonna wanna make sure that you tighten all those M3s and the last M4 as tight as you possibly can. Okay, our last step will be putting in those set screws. So for this, you're gonna wanna use the Allen wrench that looks smaller than the one that you used for the M3. The size of these set screws are M3s, but the hole size that you're using for the Allen wrench is an M2 size. So make sure you get these started here. If it feels like there's a little bit of resistance, try and make sure you get it really nice and straight, because you want to make sure you don't mess up the threads that are in that motor coupler. So it shouldn't be too hard to get in. You really want to make sure you take it nice and slow. Also be sure you don't screw these in all of the way. Right now we just want to get them placed in there and started, so that way we can put it onto our DC motor. So for this part, you're gonna wanna make sure that you find the flat part of the DC motor. That is crucial, because the set screws have to match up with that flat portion of the shaft on the DC motor. So here, mine's in kind of a tough spot because I'm right on top of that metal part of the chassis. And so you may want to take a wrench and move around the shaft of the DC motor to make it a little bit easier. That's optional. But the most important step is that you have those set screws lined up with the flat part of the DC motor. Once you have that taken care of, make sure they're good and tight. If your motor is on there secure, it doesn't look like it's going to fall off, and it moves smoothly, then you are good to go. Next, we're going to collect all the pieces we need to create our passive rolling gear. Now this process is going to look very, very similar. You want to make sure that you put M3s with washers through the standoffs. Now keep in mind, the standoffs that we're using here are a little bit shorter. That being said, the process is the exact same. Once you have all the M3s with the washers through all the standoffs and you have the main part of the gear built, it's time to put the shaft through. Now, it's really important that you use the 2 included bearings. These are called flange bearings, and so what's cool is you'll notice each bearing has a little lip, and both those will clip into the holes in the center of that passive gear and stay in nice and tight. After you have both of the bearings in place, simply put the shaft right through that passive gear. It should spin freely. The next step will be putting this much smaller bolt through that shaft that you just placed through the bearings. This is an M2, and it's really important that this bolt is as tight as possible. Once you have all those pieces in place, be sure to tighten up that passive gear as tight as you can possibly make it. Okay, so the last step is going to be attaching it to the chassis. So you'll see here I have an M4 and I have 2 large M4 washers. This part is really, really important. To get the spacing correct, you're going to want to make sure that you stick 1 M4 washer on either side of that chassis. So you'll notice that the hole for this gear is much, much larger than an M4 size. And that's actually going to be really important for later. And so you're going to take the M4 with 2 of those washers and stick that passive roller gear through that hole. Now, at this point, you're going to want to make it tight, but not all the way tight. Be sure to leave this a little bit loose. All right, so your next step is going to be creating a second passive gear the exact same way that you created that first one. This is going to be our middle passive gear, and it's going to be attached the exact same way. So you have that M4 with 2 washers, 1 washer going on either side of that black metal chassis bit. And it's going to be attached the exact same way, with that M4 and 2 washers going through the chassis and into that passive gear. You can make this gear as tight as possible. You'll notice that our top passive gear is still super loose, and that's actually really important. You're going to want to make this gear as loose as possible while still being connected. This is going to be important for getting on our track here in the next step. So you'll notice that the track has a cutout about 1/3 of the way through, and it's going to be really important that that cutout faces outward. With that top passive gear loose, you can make sure that the teeth on the inside of that track fit in between the 2 passive gears. Once you have it in place, you'll want to put some pressure to make that as tight as possible, and then tighten it into place. Once you have the tension correct, a little bit tight but not too tight, then you're going to want to make sure to tighten that bolt as tight as you possibly can. Your spacing should look just like this. Feel free to tighten things back up, and you're good to go. Now, you're going to repeat that process the exact same way for the second half of the chassis. And if you're building a Voyager, then you're going to have 4 of those. Next, we're going to talk about connecting these chassis together. So we have these U-shaped brackets, and it's kind of cool. So if you're building an Explorer, they're going to go side to side like this, one in front of the other. But if you're building a Voyager, they're going to go next to each other, and you're going to have 4 of them. Regardless of orientation, it's really straightforward. You're going to be attaching these using M4s. There are 2 bolts per side of that U-shaped bracket. Using the included T-tool and the M4 wrench you were using before, make sure you get these good and tight. Okay, once you have those M4s tightened, you are good to go and your robot is ready to conquer the world. So I hope this build video was helpful for you guys. Again, the Voyager is just the exact same step except twice. But if you have any questions about putting together your Voyager or Explorer, let us know. We are here to help every step of the way. We also have tons more videos about how to program the Voyager and Explorer, other steps in putting it together, and we have even more content coming out really soon. So if you enjoyed this video, keep an eye out for more content here to come. Have a great day, guys.